Morning, Samuel.
Morning, how are you, Andy?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you for making the time to meet and speak with me.
Oh, pleasure.
It's really looking forward to this conversation, actually. You are the author of a very interesting new book, The Power of the Outsider, A Journey of Discovery. I'm about a third halfway through,
Okay.
and already I feel like I'm with you at number 10. You were the most senior black advisor in Boris Johnson's government, amongst so many other interesting things. That's what we're going to kind of talk about, not giving it all away because people should really buy the book for themselves as well. Perhaps you can introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so as you say, Samuel Kasumu, been involved in business and politics pretty much most of my adult life. I've helped set up and grow numerous social enterprises. I suppose the one that is most current is an exec search firm called Inclusive Boards. We put people on boards of government bodies, civil society organisations, private companies, etc. And the mission is to improve diversity inclusion where decisions are being made. In politics, I've been a parliamentary candidate, been a district councillor for the last 6 years. My term is about to end. And I suppose in politics, what most people that know me for being a senior special advisor to Boris Johnson, but I was also an advisor under Theresa May, or sat on a board for her as well.
Yeah, an amazing, rich experience, and as a senior civil servant, we've had conversations offline about civil service and politics as well. So much of your experience fascinates me as well, and hopefully my listeners. Perhaps going back to some of the things at the core that really interested you or got you into politics, was there a defining moment or experience, or it was a thing that built over time?
That's a good question. I fell into student politics. So I was president of the African Caribbean Society on my campus. It was the largest in the UK, of 500 members, and I wanted to do an event, and the student union didn't stop me, but they were restricting my ability to fully express myself. And so I was like, this is not good, I'm going to run it. So I ran to be the vice president. So I wasn't arrogant enough to say I'm just going to become the president of the student union, because I had no clue what they did besides, trying to prevent me from doing events. And then I became the first student to get 1,000 votes for a contested seat on the campus. And that exposed me to all the student politics, national union student politics, and I couldn't quite relate with some of their positions on things, but I kind of knew that perhaps I had some value I could add into public life in that space, and so that's why I kind of took the political route I took. So it was certainly probably by accident. I've always been passionate about social justice, social change, but didn't necessarily think that politics was going to be a vehicle that I was going to use to try and make a difference.
Yeah. Again, I feel like I've had a similar experience. So I was postgraduate rep at my university and sat on the academic board, and that whole process, it was very basic politics. I actually had a bowl of Skittles to advertise and bring people to vote. That process, did you? I assume you found it energising, the actual process of electioneering and political activation and trying to get people into politics or to vote. How did you actually find that?
I mean, truth be told, I am an introvert, and so I don't necessarily like being out there trying to convince people to do stuff. But I think what has always driven me is two things: one, wanting to make a difference, and two, the ability to have a degree of agency over the difference that I wish to make. And so for me, running for the student union was because I wanted to do certain things, and I felt like I couldn't do it without being part of this big vehicle that has all this power. And actually being involved in politics now, I think, and doing all the things that I've been privileged to do in politics has been because of probably the same reasons. Me constantly thinking, I want to help to make a change, and recognising that government and politics is probably the most significant vehicle to express that. And I always tell people the story of years ago. I was definitely in my early 20s, and I received this invitation to go to meet Bill Gates, and I was like, this must be fake. What kid like me doesn't get invitations to go and meet with Bill Gates?
Sounds like a scam.
Sounds like a scam. But I thought, it's worth a punt. I might as well just try and show up. And it was at the House of Commons. So even as I was going to the House of Commons, I was thinking, Bill Gates is not showing up. Why on earth is this guy coming to meet with a bunch of people? And also, how did I get this invitation? But eventually, I went into the room. I got a seat towards the front, and then this guy who looks like one of the poorest people I've ever come across walks in, and of course Bill Gates. So that was the first thing that really dawned on me. It was like, actually, you know, a lot of people who are really successful don't have to show it, right? Because he's past that stage in life where he needs to have, you know, all the designer labels on his body. But the second thing that dawned on me as he began to speak was that this was at the time the richest man in the world, and he was making the case to politicians about how we could help him to further his agenda. So no matter how rich you are, no matter how successful you are, even in the world of business and enterprise, politics, government will always be the most powerful engine. And I think that's probably what drives me. I don't think I'm quite energized with the idea of having to knock on doors to convince people to vote for me. So, you know, necessary evil. I'm more energized by saying, look, if I am able to get the privilege of a position, I can use it for good.
Yeah. Really interesting that you're in spaces like executive recruitment, like advising prime ministers, advising senior civil servants and other secretaries of state, and you self-identify as an introvert. How does that work? And that probably might be also encouraging for other people who might also consider themselves, you know, not extroverts. Actually, there is a way that you can show up in these spaces. Yeah,
I mean, it's quite interesting because many years ago there was under David Cameron, there was a guy who was his director of political strategy. I think he's in the House of Lords now. He's co-founder of a polling company. And I remember meeting him, and he was so quiet, so reserved. I was thinking, this guy, you've got all this power. I was a lot younger. I was like, you've got all this power, and it doesn't make sense that you behave in such a way, right? And so even in politics, there is room for people who might not have the same nature as my former boss, Boris Johnson, right? And having said that, also being an introvert is about where you get your energy from. So I don't like constantly being around loads of people. I prefer to be by myself, or, you know, hidden away on my laptop writing books or articles or whatever. And so, you know, I get and a lot of people will be very similar and say that I don't really like being around lots of folks. So how do I make sure that I can be influential and I can get into a position where I can really make an impact? And you just have to recognize there are different ways to demonstrate your value. You know, you could be
That's really good advice.
Yeah, you know, you could be a thought leader. It's okay to engage with people one-to-one. In fact, actually, in the world of politics, there's probably a lot more power in being able to build meaningful relationships with people on a one-to-one basis versus, you know, being part of large groups. You don't have to go to a party conference and, you know, be at all the events and go to all the drinks for you to be influential. You can be influential one step at a time, one person at a time, one article at a time, one piece of research at a time, and just take things at your own pace, and you'll get to where you're meant to be.
You say books. It sounds like there's more coming. What other areas are you interested in exploring?
Yeah, I don't think I'm allowed to talk too much about what comes next in terms of after this book, but yeah, I think I like writing. It's quite therapeutic for me. It gives me an opportunity to really explore things that maybe naturally I wouldn't myself, because for me to get a good book, I really have to dig deep, and for me to dig deep, I'm going to have to do things that guys don't like to do, you know. I'm going to have to have conversations with myself or other people. I have to be really self-reflective, and I'm constantly challenged, because I'm very competitive, to make sure I can have a final product that is hopefully very good. And so that is very good for me. But there are plenty of other subjects where I feel like there is an untold story, you know. And so the story of Outsiders for me is untold because it's universal but still not fully understood. And so that was a great opportunity, and I felt like because of where I used to work, it kind of gave me the credibility to be able to craft something that was hopefully unique but important and impactful.
And without giving too much away, because I think the book goes into that and goes into your experiences within Number 10. Did you start your experience at Number 10 with the idea of being an outsider? Was it that visceral and obvious to you, or was it something that you felt over time?
I think when you work in a place like that, even during what some people would call normal times, there's no time to think. You know, I keep telling people, when you work in politics, somebody's always doing something stupid. That's just how it is, right? Or there is always a journalist who's found out that something is about to happen, or, you know, there's always a policy position that needs to.
It's kind of go.
Yeah, it's a very reactive environment. You know, you have to come in with a plan, because there's no room for you to really think about, okay, what are we going to be doing over the next 5-10 years? You're usually thinking, okay, how are we going to survive the next 2 weeks? And on top of that, of course, when I went in, nobody told me I was going to be a part of the response to a pandemic, global pandemic. Nobody knew that, right? I was so far removed from anything I anticipated would be the case, and so there wasn't a lot of time for me to reflect on, me being very different to my colleagues. But that doesn't mean it didn't have an impact, and that's the interesting thing about it. Sometimes there are things that you don't process, but still have a material impact in your ability to truly flourish. And so that's why the book is still important, even though it wasn't something I really thought about. There were 1 or 2 moments, of course, which I talk about in the book, when it was maybe quite apparent that I was different from my colleagues, or my perspective was different, or the impact of certain things would have been more material to me than to others.
And so one of the I'm at the point in the book where you're now, I think over a weekend you've been asked to bring together the Commission on Race Equality with Tony Sewell, and it's quite urgent. So I love to, because that's one of the points I think you're actually working on, racial equality. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to explore just some of your views about that, how further you think we have to go, whether actually there is a consensus building about the right ways of going about things, or...
Yeah, I think progress is relative, and so if you were to ask somebody that was born in 2000 or 2001 if we have made progress on race equality, their answer would probably be very different from somebody who was around during the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? It's very relative, and actually the level of expectation, I think, is significantly higher as well, because the base is different, in my opinion. And that is some of the complexities that you see playing out in public debate right now. And actually, if you cast your mind back to the 80s when we were having riots, well, those riots were very different, in my opinion, to perhaps the protests that we saw in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, because actually a lot of people outside of Downing Street protesting at that moment were graduates who were worried about if they were going to be discriminated against as they tried to climb up the corporate ladder. And that was a very different type of protest to those in the 80s who perhaps were dealing with types of discrimination that were maybe more overt, tensions with the police, which still exist today, but actually were manifested in maybe more aggressive ways at that moment. And so we've made progress, but the desire for more progress is still there and still strong. And I also think that the final stretch will be probably the most difficult because it's the most complicated. And so if you look at race equality now, there are nuances. Black African kids do better than Black Caribbeans in academia. The British Indians economically are doing better than pretty much every other ethnic group, including the white majority. Whereas in the 60s, 70s and 80s, it was very clear that black was an umbrella term for people, folks who were black, Asian, Arab, because their experiences or their baselines were very similar. And then they were all experiencing overt racism from the National Front, etc., etc. And so I think the final stretch, more complicated, makes it more difficult. But certainly progress has been made.
And do you think the kind of public discourse and social consciousness needs to understand those differences? So, for example, BAME no longer being a functional term, and treating things within more nuanced kind of ethnic groupings? Yeah,
but it does make it more difficult. You can't put that into a soundbite. The only soundbite that works is, BAME is no longer a credible term, and people can sign up to that. Okay, then what next? Because you can be Rishi Sunak and be someone who's relatively privileged and still experience racism. I'm sure he probably gets racist abuse every day online. You could be a former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who said many times that she's experienced racism in her career, but you were a leader of one of the great offices of state. And so racism is so much more complicated than simply saying I've been discriminated against, and trying to work out the nuances between that and somebody's ability to self-actualize economically is interesting. Especially now when you have a moment where people are not necessarily all in traditional jobs. A lot of people who choose to be self-employed or social media influencers or whatever. And so it's just a much more complicated subject. And because people don't trust our politicians, it's more difficult for people to trust that politicians are trying to deal with this complicated subject in the right way. And a lot of public discourse now is focused on having to choose a side, you know. There's a war in the Middle East. Are you pro-Palestinian? Are you pro-Israel? Or there is a transgender person. Are you pro them being able to do X or pro them being able to do Y? Like everything in this moment that we're in, this age that we're in, is focused on people just having to pick a side when the answers are usually somewhere muddily in the middle, and that's the
us coming together, finding common ground, trusting.
Exactly, common ground is the important thing. Being able to build relationships with people that you might feel you don't have much in common with, or you might feel like you don't agree with, is very important, and that's not what we're doing enough of. We need to find more ways for people to meet, and leaders have a responsibility to try and facilitate that engagement. But we're in an election year. It's going to be a very difficult message to sell, because all the major parties are going to be focused on trying to demonstrate that they are better than the other person,
and they are different from the
other person, and the other person's trash, and etc. etc. And maybe years ago you could do that and say, look, after the election we're all going to come together and be friends again. But how likely is that going to be in 2024? I wouldn't bet on it. So we've got big challenges. What we need is a new generation, a political class that does better. I can't see that coming in the short term, but I think it's certainly something we have to fight for.
Talking about building trust and relationships, as an outsider, how did you find that within Number 10 and the civil service infrastructure? We've spoken privately about working with other departments. Was that something that you were surprised about, how easy or hard it was?
Yeah, I mean, I went to Downing Street. It was an outsider for many reasons. Didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. Didn't work for Boris when he was London mayor. I wasn't part of the vote leave set that Boris led for the European Union referendum, and I wasn't a legacy hire from one of the previous PMs, and I didn't work in Whitehall before. Very much, an anomaly in that respect. Like,
coming from just
literally asked to come in because there was a specific expertise that I had, and so. We can have that big debate around, is that how special advisors should be chosen? Just folks who are just, mates with someone or somebody that somebody knows, but that's just the way the world works right now, right? And so I went in there, but my objective was to demonstrate my value from the start, because I knew for a lot of people they wouldn't know much about me, so that was that. And then in terms of the civil service, I guess every special advisor is technically an outsider from the civil service, because again, didn't come in through traditional means, technically a political appointment, not a civil servant who applied in the right way and all that jazz. And so for me, I chose just to own the fact that I was different from the civil servants, but also that I was different from my colleagues. And so I was just like, I'm not just going to have a conversation with some officials and then accept that they told me something's not possible, or accept that they told me that this is going to take a long time, or accept the fact that they're going to do what they usually do to try and delay something happening. Well, yeah, you probably shouldn't. But if I felt like actually, these guys are not quite aligned with my way of thinking, because I wasn't from where everybody else was from, I'd behave differently. I'd just go and do things myself. Or I'd convene groups myself. I'd say, okay, fine, I'm going to bring all these people together and we're going to figure out how we're going to do it. And sometimes they were internal, like during the pandemic, for example. Big challenges are, vaccine deployment. Big challenges around misinformation, and a lot of the officials responsible were based in different departments, and they had their own areas that they were looking after. DCMS had all the relationships with, all the social media companies that they really felt like they needed to protect their relationship over Facebook, TikTok, or whatever, and then the rapid response unit was doing their thing, etc. And they didn't really talk to each other. So one weekend I was like, actually, I'm going to create this group. It's going to be a working group. Every single department responsible for anything to do with misinformation will have to report in every other week, and I'm going to chair this. So I just spoke to the PM. He's just like, sure, and then I did it. And I know they were thinking, well, who's this guy thinking that we're basically going to be all coordinated here with our response to misinformation? But I was just like, no, I'm not going to allow you just to work in your silos. And I'm not from where my colleagues are from. I just want to do it. If I want to do something, I'll do it. And by the time I left, to be honest, a lot of officials respected that. And so there was things that maybe were not necessarily supposed to be part of my own portfolio, but because they knew that I liked to get stuff done, and also because of where I was from, those things I was genuinely passionate and interested in, then they would reach out to me, and then they'd say, well, can we have a meeting? And I'd say yes. And sometimes they'd bring like 24 of them. I'm like, how are we going to fit into this room? But I could see what they were doing was they'd found a special advisor that was a bit different, and was willing to do certain things that others were just not interested in, like an action plan for Gypsy River travellers, or getting the mental health white paper over the line before Christmas of 2020, I think it was. Things that others were probably less interested in, I was willing to fight for. So I think by the end of it, there was a mutual respect, but an acknowledgement that I wasn't from where everybody else was from, so I was not going to behave in the same way. In fact, my philosophy was just I was going to ask for forgiveness and not permission, to be honest, which is not necessarily how folks are supposed to operate in Whitehall, right?
Yeah, you're very self-aware and of yourself, of your outsideness, of your otherness, which I suppose comes from, as you were saying earlier, kind of the introspection of talking to yourself, working on yourself, etc. Has that been something that was activated recently, or you kind of grown up being aware of the need to know oneself?
To be honest, everywhere I've been, I've always felt different. So my household, pretty much everyone except for me is like an extrovert, and I have 5 siblings. It's just a really loud house, and I stood out because I was not loud, right? And going to school, I was in and out of schools because of my behaviour, because I didn't quite understand myself, they didn't quite understand me, and so I was on my, when I went to university, I was on my way to Imperial College. I decided not to go there, and I went to Brunel, and pretty much nobody from my area. Grew up in Barnet, North London. The last school I went to was a really good school, and nobody followed me to Brunel. So I was outside of there. In fact, in my last school, I was very much an outsider. There was like two black kids before I went into my class, and so I've always just felt different, and I don't know if it's something I've accepted, but it's just something I've just known is the case. If that makes sense. Downing Street was the one place where I needed to make sure that my difference was not something that held me back. Everywhere else, I've kind of just been like, well, yeah, I am who I am. But that place, I had to really say, look, everybody there is different from you, but you have to, why you're here. There's a difference for you to make, and so you need to use your difference, not necessarily reflect on how it might have impacted my experience, but make sure you're using it, and make sure you recognise all the time that people are relying on you to do a good job, and lives and livelihoods are at stake, even before the pandemic.
Just based on numbers and practical probability, not everyone who would like to be inside, the Whitehall corridors of power will be able to get in there. So I'd love to maybe see if you've got advice for someone or people who, or may just not even feel comfortable being inside because they feel like inside, but they won't have that same strength that you have to actually exist within those spaces. What would be your advice for people wanting to make an impact in society and politics outside of Whitehall Civil Service number 10?
Yeah, well, firstly, I think everybody should have a sense of mission, and that mission is around what difference do you want to make in your world. And so your world could be your local area, your world could be your school, your university, your place of work. It could be within your family, If you see somebody in life that is really balanced, well-rounded, has great character, it's very likely that somebody, whether it's family or an extension of that, was it pivotal in that. So everybody's mission is different, but the impact to you needs to be focused on making somebody or some people's lives better. And then once you have that sense of mission, then it's important to commit to continuous development. You know, how you constantly challenging yourself to learn, to be better, to do better. Where you get access to your information, how you're finding ways to really, you know, remove yourself from the noise of life and social media, etc., and really like sharpening your saw and becoming an expert in your space. And I think the other thing I would say is everybody needs other people to help them along the way. So you've got to build that network of people that you help, yes, people who are maybe on similar journeys to yourself, and folks who've gone ahead of you, and because they will not only impart information, but they will be the ones that are your champions when you're not in the room. You know, people always ask, how did the guy that you end up in Dance Street? Well, there were people who knew about my work, and so they were the ones
who advocated and spoke up for you when you weren't there.
Exactly that. And
yeah.
So and another thing I'll say is just it's good to be good. And it's not just good to be good because it's okay to be. It's a good thing to be a good person, but also people will remember. You know, people will remember if they think, okay, I met Ade, he was a good guy, I had a good conversation with him, he was really helpful. Maybe he put me in touch with someone. It didn't cost him anything, but the fact that he remembered me is something that really stuck with me. You know, you never really know who's going to come back and say, well, I remember that guy really helped me out. Right?
Yeah, I've seen that a lot in my life. Because you spoke about family, and I know we're slowly running out of time, so kind of last couple of questions, but spoke about family and your experience. I'm just trying to imagine a young Samuel, big house, and you being slightly different there. In my area, where I'm from, East London, particularly West Ham, Stratford, Beckton, some issues with families being around to help raise people is impacts on upbringing some young teenagers, particularly young black boys who may not have that kind of male figure in their lives that helps. Is that something that you have had experience about, or you have any thoughts about how to address, or do you think actually the level of government social engineering should be less or more when it comes to that kind of dynamic of family support for young people, particularly in challenging urban situations?
Yeah, I grew up in single parent home. So my parents split up when I was 7 or 8. I can't remember, it's a bit hazy. But I think I had the privilege of finding a local church with my siblings when we were quite young, and that's where I kind of saw like imagery of like family units, etc. Only God knows what those families were like behind closed doors, but nonetheless I could see, okay, well, this is what families can or could or should look like. And so I think it's important to find community or to create community where there are absences of male role models for men. I think we have a society now where a lot of guys are struggling to find a real meaning for what makes them a man.
Yeah.
Because bluntly, women are doing better academically. Economically, women are at least on a par in terms of their horizons around their professions. Yes, we have gender pay gaps, but nonetheless, if you're more granular around the data, you'll find that women are on a much more consistent trajectory. Whereas a lot of guys are really struggling to think, okay, fine, if I'm not the provider, and if I'm not someone that's supposed to be like, really masculine with a lot of bravado, and if I'm not viewed as X in society, and if I didn't have my dad around when he was younger, and my mum did everything and she was awesome, so how am I supposed to function here? What does it really mean to be a man? And so I think we've got some big challenges there, but I think what we do need is more men who are part of their community to have maybe more prominence in how they're engaging with a lot of our young men who are lost for no fault of their own. It's very easy to look at a young boy who's maybe been involved in some kind of violent crime and say, well, that kid, he's just got anger management issues, or he's just an evil evil young boy that's lost, but actually there were probably many moments, well there definitely are, many moments in that young man's life when there was a need for an intervention and it didn't come.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to think about how we can do better. And the answer is not just to say, well, we need to make sure that men stay at home and they don't leave their kids, or they don't start, as colloquials put it, spreading their seed.
I think it's a really big conversation, particularly around the idea of, particularly for black men, because there is an intersection of feminism and, as you say, women having more choice now, particularly with the introduction of birth control. Having more choice to further their careers, in which they are excelling at. Yes, there is a pay gap, which is shrinking. And so I feel like there's a kind of conversation where black men being asked to give up a privilege they didn't know existed, because they have their own intersectionality of race and gender, where whilst as a gender they might have more power, quote unquote power, but with a race they don't, and now black women are doing. Yeah, it's a very interesting knotty area, but I think the idea of building community, more of it is really important.
Yeah, people always say you can't be it if you can't see it, and they always use that in like maybe the career sense. You need more black and Asian folks in positions of influence. I agree with that, and that's why I set up inclusive boards. But I think actually that also is true in the sense of community. If you're a young black male and you've never had a black man in your house, or for most of your life you haven't, and then you go into your community and the only role models you see are folks who maybe are not necessarily a positive influence, what do we then expect the outcome to be? And so I think there just needs to be more of us. You asked a question around the state intervention versus individuals, etc. I just think actually communities is the happy medium. But we need to have more communities where actually the men who are the role models are able to have more prominence, more presence, more respect, to be honest, in their community for what they represent, and that will go such a long way into fixing some of our big challenges.
Yeah, Samuel, let's wrap up. Like I said, I'm halfway through this really interesting read. As a bit of a plug, what else do I have to look forward to? In terms of just the experiences of things I'm going to find out about you and being an outsider within Number 10.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the book is it's not just about me. Yeah, my journey is interwoven into it, but I speak to so many fascinating people, and so you're going to hear from, which you haven't read about yet, the former chairman of Sainsbury's. You're going to hear from a family of classical musicians, and I suppose people always ask me, so what was it like to be in Downing Street? And actually, dare I say it, that's the part I leave towards the end. And people always ask, so why did you leave? And so I answer that question very explicitly towards the end of the book. So it's a real journey of discovery that I was on as part of writing the book, that I hope the reader also can go on and again, hopefully it makes a difference.
Well, you've definitely whetted my appetite to make sure I finish the rest of it. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thanks for having me.